While so-called traditional slavery has almost disappeared from the face of the earth, modern forms of slavery have emerged. But what does traditional slavery mean? The definition is a legal one, as there was once a time when slavery was legal. Slavery resulted from the fact that one person could have a right of ownership over another. The slave was then considered a thing or an animal which could be bought, sold, rented, and exploited. So-called traditional slavery has been abolished and has now almost disappeared. However, millions of people around the world still work in conditions that, in practice, are not so far removed from those of the slaves of yesteryear. This is what is called forced labour, or sometimes modern slavery. We have thus moved from a legal situation to a factual situation, whose multiple and ambiguous forms make it extremely difficult to identify and fight. Does this mean that you have to give up? The abolition of the so-called traditional slavery was the subject of a long struggle, and with good reason. In the 19th century, it was the basis of the economy of the colonies. A lot of powerful interests had to be overcome, and therefore a lot of resistance. More than 150 years after the abolition of the so-called traditional slavery, the eradication of forced labour in turn represents a comparable challenge. So let's compare. The eradication of traditional slavery began in the first decades of the 19th century, with the abolition of the right to own slaves. Similarly, the first formal act in the fight against modern forms of slavery was a prohibition in international law of forced labour. But what are the laws worth without the will and even the determination to enforce them? At the beginning of the 19th century, several North American and European states, noting the impossibility of immediately abolishing slavery, decided to prohibit the trade. Let us remember from history the pragmatic and progressive nature of the approach. From the 1820s onwards, the English resorted to the use of force and had the Royal Navy patrol the Atlantic to intercept slave ships. While a pragmatic but determined approach is still required, the problem today cannot be solved by the army. Then we really tackle slavery itself. Remaining pragmatic, Western states realised that, to enforce abolition, it was necessary to overcome the resistance of powerful and influential slave owners. France and England would have to take out heavy loans to compensate them. However, the financial effort was not pushed to the point of compensating the slaves themselves. Today, modern slavery is estimated to bring in around $150 billion a year to a whole constellation of actors. Make no mistake, to eradicate forced labour, one must be prepared to go against established interests and expect to encounter some resistance. The same applies to modern slavery as to traditional slavery. Putting end to it will, today as in the past, shake up the habits and short-term interests of consumers, companies and states. This requires determination, time and pragmatism. Let us not be discouraged. Finally, the states that have abolished traditional slavery have only been far better off.